Hello, and welcome to Freedom Conversations, where we help you to navigate the world, the complicated world of faith and mental health and all its various dynamics. Um, Today, I'm going to bring a really interesting conversation with Will Van Der Hart about OCD. Now, Will Van Der Hart is a name that many of you people will recognize. He started Mind and Soul Foundation over 20 years ago. He's been very open about his struggles with anxiety, especially after the London bombings. Um, and but he hasn't talked about OCD very much. In fact, as you'll hear in this interview, he explains how for almost 20 years it was something that a diagnosis that he held internally, and didn't feel like it was something he wanted to share publicly about. But that has all changed with his new book, When Thoughts Get Stuck. So he joins me today to talk about that, to talk about his personal journey. We dive into what OCD actually is, how you navigate it from a faith perspective, and what does it mean to think about and talk about healing and prayer when it comes to OCD. It's a conversation I think you're going to really enjoy, especially if you are in a position of pastoral responsibility, and you've got to provide help and support for people who potentially have OCD or obsessive thinking, or maybe you yourself have been struggling with this, but it's been something that you have held inside and something you've navigated on your own. I really hope today's conversation will take some of that shame away, and actually give you the confidence to know how to think about it and talk about it, especially from a faith perspective. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Will Van Der Hart. Okay, Will, thank you so much for sitting down to have this conversation today. When it comes to the world of faith and mental health, you've been such a key voice for such a long time, helping the church navigate this area. So there are loads of things that we could talk about, but we are going to zoom in today on your journey with OCD or obsessive thinking. You've just co-authored a new book called When Thoughts Get Stuck, all about OCD, which I'm really looking forward to talk about. And there's lots to explore in this area. I want to talk about definitions, how it impacts identity. I'd love to think about the concept of healing when it comes to an issue like OCD. That would be really interesting. But before we think about it more broadly, I wanted to wind the clock back and start with your story, Will. When did you first notice, to use your title, that your thoughts get stuck? Is it something you've navigated since childhood or adulthood?
Yeah, thanks, Bryn. It's great to be here. Always lovely to share some time with the team at Mercy, and love what you guys are doing and always have done. So yeah, it's really. I mean, this is my 10th book in emotional health, and it's probably one I should have written a long time ago, but I didn't really have the courage to actually kind of own it. It's quite strange because I've always owned the anxiety disorder element of what I do, but I've always avoided really naming the obsessive compulsive element. And I think there's quite a lot of shame around it.
Mm.
Um, I had an anxiety based breakdown in 2005 following the London bombings. I think I've accounted for quite well and wrote the worry book following that. And I've always referenced these intrusive anxiety based thoughts, but actually recognizing that they were more problematic than just being fleeting thoughts is something that I was struggling with. And looking back on my journey, I can definitely see elements of these in childhood. So I think I was probably 7 or 8 when I started having intrusive, anxious thoughts. But of course, you just think that's normal. You think you're going through what everyone else is going through. And I think earliest thoughts were around contamination and harm and thinking about other people becoming harmed.
Yeah.
And I think one of the first compulsions I remember doing was separating out my toothbrush and putting it in a separate pot to
Mm.
my family, or making sure it was turned bristles outwards, because somehow I had this idea that my toothbrush might contaminate other people's toothbrushes and that they might die. So
Mm.
early contamination fears, and they're always orientated around harms coming to other people rather than harms coming to me.
Interesting. And when you say that it took you a while to kind of admit and own that, and you talked about the fact that you felt there was a bit of shame. How, when did you start to realize that actually this wasn't normal and it wasn't just the anxious thing? So it seems like you kind of, in your mind, there is a difference between those two things, between
Yeah,
the anxiety and the obsessive thoughts.
yeah.
When did you realize that actually they're not the same thing? There is something different and therefore need to be treated differently?
So it was actually during my recovery from the anxiety disorder that I had,
Yeah.
and it was sort of now pushing into 2006, where I had treatment for the anxiety, and my anxious sort of levels. I had been struggling with panic attacks, and I'd been shaking and experienced a lot of physical symptoms of anxiety. And when they all dissipated, I was left with still quite powerful, intrusive thoughts.
Mm.
And at the time, they were very orientated around feelings of historic guilt, which was completely displaced, but small things w- felt bigger than they really were. And I learned that OCD has two core elements, and one is doubt and one is guilt. So feeling unnecessarily guilty, but also unnecessarily doubt filled.
Mm.
And so I remember, being, I was, just in my flat with my wife, and I remember I got a book. It was a general book around anxiety, and then there was a chapter on obsessive thinking and obsessive thoughts. And I remember reading that chapter and being like, oh my goodness, this writer has basically named something
Yeah.
which isn't just pertinent to now, but I could see it in my history.
Mm.
Um, and looking back, I realized that I'd always over apologized for things. I'd often thought, I might have accidentally offended someone. I'd be checking, I'm sorry, did I offend you, or did something I say upset you? I remember sort of replaying events. I'd replay events in my minds that were kind of ambiguous, and I wasn't always a Christian, so I'd be like, maybe I look back on a night where I had too much to drink, and I'd start obsessing about whether I did something wrong or hurt someone, or did something, and it was all ambiguous. It was all sort of living in doubt and guilt. So suddenly, when I read this chapter, I was like, oh my goodness, this is real. Like, this is an actual thing, and it's really resonating with me, and it's more than being anxious. So that was the sort of starting point of not just going, what happened to me last year, but actually, what's been happening to me for the last 30 years.
And so what happened from that point? So did you, like, take your wife, for example, did you share that you'd read this chapter and it named it, and what was her response to that? Did she get it? She was like, "Yep, I can see that." Did it take a bit of journeying through?
I mean, I think, like, my wife at the time, and she'd seen me sort of go from this being really confident, leader character who's always sort of like, trailblazing and was always sort of out there doing the next thing, to really being a shell of myself,
Yeah.
and being off work and struggling to sleep and struggling to eat, and I was in a real mess with the anxiety after the London bombings, and so. I mean, I think she was exhausted, but also curious. And she was very much of a mind saying, okay, well, great. I mean, what's that mean? And like, what do you do now? Um, I tend to do deep dives into everything. So having read this chapter, I then was like, okay, well, I need to know what what this is. And I did some research online, and I found actually there's a relatively small good library of OCD books. Um, One of them's famously called The Imp of the Mind by Lee Bayer, and I remember reading that, and that was even more sort of like specific and going, okay, this really resonates. And then Fred Penzel wrote the sort of Overcoming Obsessive Thoughts book, which is about that thick, and I read that and was like, okay, yeah. And then I read Paul Skavaskis, David Veal, and I sort of read these books. I don't know what I was trying to do. I think I was probably obsessively trying to be sure that this was my problem. I probably read 4 books, and then, you know, not everything resonated. So I didn't have hardly any external rituals at all. So obsessive compulsive disorder are 2 things: obsessions, which are intrusive thoughts,
Yeah.
and compulsions, which are neutralizing behaviors, which make those thoughts more comfortable.
Okay. Yeah.
I had lots and lots of obsessional thoughts, but as far as I understood it, I didn't have any real compulsions. So anyone who saw me wouldn't think there was anything weird going on. But it wasn't until I came across the writings of a guy called Stephen Phillipson, who ran a sort of community called OCD Online, that I suddenly found out that actually you didn't have to have compulsions for you to have OCD. So he used a term which he doesn't use anymore, which was called pure O. And this was just like almost like an obsession only form of OCD.
Mm.
But then latterly realized actually it wasn't purely O. It was that the compulsions were internal, they were mental.
Mm.
So I was, I might have an intrusive thought, and then I might spend a long time ruminating or thinking about it, or even praying about it, which was a way of me neutralizing it. And so I sort of worked out, okay, I look, like I'm not struggling, but sometimes I am struggling. And I realized this had been a relatively long battle for me. And there was relief in finding a diagnosis, and also some terror, and particularly where Christianity is concerned, suddenly a huge amount of complexity. So like, what do I do with this?
Yeah, it's gonna be one of my questions for you is what that process of diagnosis was like. Like, was it empowering because it gave you terminology to explain what was going on for you? Or was it I imagine it's quite overwhelming as well because then it totally reframes everything. So I imagine you look back on your childhood and kind of just saw everything through a different lens because all of a sudden you saw it through the lens of OCD thinking or obsessive compulsive thinking.
I mean, part of OCD is that OCD isn't explicable or necessarily believable. So, you might have a terrifying thought and your disposition to believe the thought.
Yeah.
So even if you're like going, no, that's just my OCD, in a way, that reassurance, it runs out of steam quite quickly,
Mm,
because if it was that easy to dismiss these thoughts,
mm,
no one would have OCD. Part
mm.
of the problem of OCD is the stickiness of the thought itself.
Yeah.
So you never get that feeling of reassurance. Um, and so, yes, I look back and think about a lot of time wasted and a lot of like private agony
Mm,
about things. Things I describe in the book, being about 9, and I remember being at a friend's birthday party on a farm, and there was this dilapidated farm building, and everyone was throwing stones at these little windows right up high. And I managed to hit the jackpot, and I broke one of these little windows. But I just remember looking up, and there was this little tang of glass, like a dinosaur tooth, sort of lodged into the frame, and it was just sort of dangling there. And I had this terrible thought of like that falling down and killing a farmer or something,
mm,
and I just couldn't shake it. And probably for 3 or 4 years, I was agonizing about whether someone was going to die because of that piece of glass. Now, I'm 50 now. I could describe that piece of glass to you perfectly,
mm,
like, and that is, I could, 40 years later, I can still tell you exactly what that looked like.
mm,
And that's the difference between a normal thought and an OCD thought.
mm.
A normal thought is like, a gust of wind. An OCD thought is like a hurricane. That's the difference in strength. It's like, one is just tiny and passing, and the other one is very powerful and very destructive.
And so knowledge is power, and often even just understanding what's going on for some people is one of the biggest light bulb moments of going, "Oh, hang on a sec, I make sense." The idea of "I make
Yeah.
sense" in the way that thing made sense. For you, what was the journey from realizing that that is what was going on for you and that there was this diagnosis of OCD to actually starting to see what recovery looks like or what
Mm.
navigating OCD looks like? What was that journey like?
One of the first things about OCD, I mean, OCD keeps you in a box. It really is very shame orientated, and different people have different themes. My themes always have been about harm coming to people that I love, or
Yeah.
acting kind of inappropriately and causing harm to others. Um, but that makes me a very safe person because I'm always like very on guard. Other people have other sorts of thoughts, and they can be pretty unpleasant. They can have thoughts around sexual harms, violence, obviously contaminations, existential thoughts. Pretty much you can think about anything that intrudes in the mind, and it can be quite overwhelming for them. And the natural tendency is to keep OCD secret. In fact, the onset to diagnosis period on average is 17 years.
Wow.
So, on average, a person's been struggling for 17 years before they've ever got an OCD diagnosis.
And is
And I
that
think that
because of
shows
what
you how much shame there is.
yeah, and is that one of the questions I was gonna ask when you said that it's very shame orientated was, are you talking about inner shame as in the desire is there to kind of to try and hide these thoughts as much as possible, or shame into societally in terms of being able to talk openly about this stuff?
Well, I think that, I mean, there's the primary shame is the inner shame of, like, particularly people who have thoughts which are sort of unpleasantly, unpleasant thoughts that they might be, a murderer, for example. So they'd be thinking, why on earth am I having these crazy thoughts? Like, I'm potentially danger. Obviously they don't realize that they've got OCD, so it's not, the danger isn't the issue. But there's a lot of shame around having the thoughts. But there's also a lot of stigma around OCD. So, you know, other disorders like depression, anxiety, everyone's like, "Oh, poor you, you've got this." If you've got OCD, people are like, "Oh, you're someone who sort of matches up the Coke cans in your fridge, or you sharpen all your pencils and put them in a row." There's
Mm,
quite a parody about what
mm,
OCD looks like, and quite a lot of misunderstanding around it too. So there is an inner shame, but there's also a societal shame still associated with it. And I guess the first thing I did was I worked out pretty conclusively that I think I have OCD. The second thing I did was I booked an appointment with a psychiatrist to get a proper assessment. And I went to see a great guy called Dr. David Veal, who is a really well known kind of OCD expert, the top sort of voice in the field. I only saw him once, and I talked through my experiences. He's like, "Will, you've got OCD for sure, but you're also highly functional.
mm,
And where you are, you're living both in freedom and also you're living with OCD." So he was like, "Your level of freedom and your self awareness is great. Um, and I'd want clients to get to your kind of level of self understanding.
mm,
But where you are is a good place, not a bad place." He said to me, "Look, OCD is a chronic disorder. You cannot get rid of it. It's not like there's no healing for OCD. There is medication that can help, but there is no healing for OCD. It's a chronic disorder." And he said, you have to kind of accept that if you want to find freedom. So if you're trying to escape OCD,
mm,
it will come up and grab you. And
mm.
if you're like befriending the monster, it's okay. So that part of the journey was disclosure, was actually saying, yeah, this is my problem. Now, ironically, that was a long time ago, but I really kept the OCD discussion probably to a minimum publicly for a very long time, for 20, for 20 years.
Because
I think for a number, I mean, I think again, I'm like working as a priest. I'm like aware that it's milk and meat. Not everything is for public consumption. I already was being very transparent about my mental health, and I felt like actually some of this stuff is just for me.
mm,
A mentor wisely said to me, the difficult thing about public ministry is working out what's your battle and what's everyone else's battle. And I felt like OCD was my battle, and maybe anxiety was everyone's battle that I was going to fight
yeah.
in the public arena. Um, I think over the last couple of years, I felt a lot more relaxed about talking about OCD. And actually, I'm of an age where I care a bit less. Um, and I realize actually that over probably particularly the last 10 years, people with OCD keep finding me and sort of saying, "Hey, this is my problem." And I've had these really sort of weird off book conversations with people that's been helpful to them. And I felt increasingly like I need to talk more about this more publicly now. And I feel I'm of an age and stage where I can do that and suffer whatever bumps and bruises there might be in the process.
So I'm assuming that's the point in which you thought, well, this is a book that needs to be written. And so, like, what prompted you to go? Yeah, I need to talk about this now. I need to write the book. And you didn't write the book on your own. You co-authored it with Thea. So tell me a little bit about Thea and your
Yeah.
relationship with her.
So so the journey's a little bit less romantic than that in terms of my inspiration to write. Thea had been very interested in mental health and spirituality as a student, and she'd reached out to me several times, and we'd had some coffees when I was working at HDB, where she was wanting to discuss theology and mental health. And she'd referenced with me that she'd struggled with OCD, and she was one of the people who I'd had these off-book conversations with. um, and then she said to me about 18 months ago now, maybe 2 years, she said, "Will, I've decided I want to write a book about my struggles with OCD." And I was busy applauding her, saying, "Great job, Thea, that's fantastic." And she sort of said, "Will you support me, supervise me as I kind of go through the journey?" And I was like, "Absolutely, 100%." Um, but she's never written a book before. She's actually a brilliant copy editor. So she knows a lot about writing and editing. Um, but what actually happened was she wrote a first chapter which was very biographic and fantastic, but maybe would have, benefit from the tools that I can bring and more of my experience. So we worked on that for quite a long time, just her, and she was becoming a bit exasperated by the writing process. And I felt the prompting of the Lord, but I just said, look, Thea, I want to help you. I believe in the book. How would you feel about me maybe coming on board and giving you a hand? And she was like, I thought you'd never ask, uh, but it was a natural fit
Yeah.
for her.
And
And so we stepped out together.
did it feel like an easy decision for you to make, considering you'd spent 20 years thinking, actually, no, this is my journey and not everybody else's?
I mean, I think Thea's courage and her great personality and just the battle. I mean, she's faced much harder battles than me with OCD. I really wanted to like bless her and partner with her.
Mm.
And I felt like if she can talk about her experiences, then I can definitely talk about mine.
Yeah.
And so it's been a great partnership. I love co-writing. I find it hugely inspirational. It's a massive blessing. I think it's a great adjunct to the kind of ego that often appears in writers, when they sole write and they become the sort of sole arbiter of all their material. I love the protection that it offers. And it's been brilliant writing with Thea. So yeah, we've shared our stories together, but also built the tools for the reader,
Yeah.
understanding particularly what is OCD, but also understanding uniquely how OCD interacts with Christian faith.
Yeah, well, I wanted to bring the faith element in because I'm really interested about this, and it might be that this is the natural point to start talking a bit more overtly about the book and what you've written. But something you said earlier on in the conversation really stuck with me. You said OCD has the tendency to create, I can't remember exactly the word you use, but it's doubt and guilt. Those are kind of
Yeah.
the two things that it kind of draws out. Which you put those two concepts of doubt and guilt into the faith lens, and it's kind of fascinating because that is the bedrock of so much of the stuff we talk about. And guilt is almost used as a justification for faith. It's like, we are bad people, we're inherently bad people, and so, and we need forgiveness, and we're sinful by nature. And so i'm just I'm pretty fascinated, to be honest, as to what those messages would sound like to someone that is already grappling with those, with doubt and guilt as two massive inner thought processes. Yeah, how those two things play off each other. Um, and one of the questions I had for you, when you're thinking about faith, does it help simplify things because it gives you a lens in which to process, or does it massively complicate things because it's another layer in which you're having to navigate your OCD?
I mean, I think it's hugely complexifying, if I'm really honest. And I mean, interesting, we're not alone. Martin Luther famously had OCD, if you were measuring him by a modern metric. And probably most famously, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is all about his OCD journey.
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote a preceding book about his wicked thoughts, which he wrote in prison, which was pretty nonsensical unless you have OCD. But then he made sense of it all by basically describing the inner landscape of his mind. And so Pilgrim's Progress really makes sense of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Um, as a Christian, obviously there's a strong energy in someone with OCD to escape from guilt.
Yeah.
And so the Christian gospel is a powerful invitation for someone with OCD, because people with OCD tend to feel more guilt
Yeah.
than is natural. There's no problem with engaging with guilt. The difficult thing is understanding what's real guilt and what's false guilt.
Yeah.
So much of OCD is around the sort of minutiae of guilt, and it's the law, not the spirit of the law.
Mm.
We spend a long time exploring how Scripture powerfully interacts with OCD. For example, Jesus says, "If you've even looked at a woman adulterously, you've committed adultery." Now, if you have OCD, you're obviously having thousands of intrusive and
Yeah.
quite often quite unpleasant thoughts every day. But one of the great reliefs is that these are just thoughts, that they have no meaning. And if you truly believe that because you've thought the thought, you've committed the act, you're going to feel absolutely catastrophic guilt, because the meaning of the thought, has just gone from nonsensical to having real life
Yeah.
impacts.
Yeah.
Then you've got things like the unforgivable sin. So if you want to create real anxiety in an OCDer, tell them that there is a way by which they haven't been saved, which is blaspheming the Holy Spirit. Because as soon as you tell an OCD that, the OCD itself will start generating
Yeah.
thoughts which are an offense to the Holy Spirit.
Mm,
So you might, many OCDs will have thoughts of swearing against the Holy Spirit,
yeah.
not because they want to, but it's almost like a internal and automatic device.
Yeah.
So suddenly they're thinking, I'm no longer saved, as a good example. Um, I mean, there's so many, there's the curious questions at the end of Matthew 25 where Jesus is saying, many will say, Lord, Lord, and I'll say, I never knew you, get away from me.
Mm.
And you were like, am I in? Am I
Yeah.
not in? That level of doubt is just
Yeah.
so significant.
So
And if you,
how did you unpack that then? How do you go about reconciling some of those tensions for people that are struggling with OCD?
I mean, it's crucial as someone who suffers from OCD that we don't allow our feelings to dictate our well-being.
Yeah.
So most people with OCD are chasing a feeling of settlement. And initially, when you get reassurance, you feel great. It's a huge dopamine hit. So, if someone comes to me as a priest and says, look, well, I'm really sorry, I think I might have committed the unforgivable sin. Normally, by virtue of that conversation, I'll show them that because they're concerned about it, it's not a problem. They haven't committed it.
Yeah.
Um, and they'll feel huge relief. The trouble is OCD can hear, some with OCD can hear those words, but that reassurance will last for 10 seconds and then they'll still feel a sort of agony inside. Constantly trying to settle that agony by getting reassurance is a mistake.
Mm.
And that's what perpetuates this cycle of compulsions. So a core part of recovery is going, it's okay not to feel settled. Ultimately, Christianity is not a feeling, it's an interaction with the real and living God.
Mm.
So if God says I'm free, I'm free. You know, um, it's leaning much more into the actual words of the Lord, what the Lord has said, what the Lord has done, what the Lord has spoken, and it's much less about how we ourselves feel like we have agency to solve the problems for ourselves. So I think that's a really core sort of shift. I mean, in the book, we explore theologically what each text actually means to give people a much better context of understanding.
Yeah.
So, for example, around the worry thoughts, do not be anxious in everything but in everything by prayer and petition, bringing a request to God. It's not condemnation anxiety, it's an encouragement to do the right thing
Yeah.
with your anxiety.
Mm.
So we're helping OCDs understand what the text actually means,
Yeah.
but also we're leaning towards these two interventions: ACT therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is really a trust-based therapy that we don't know, but God knows. There's a sort of agency of the Lord. And the second one is ENRP, which is the kind of gold standard treatment for OCD, which is to expose yourself to the thing that you fear without reassurance until it no longer bothers you. So
Mm.
this is a kind of boredom effect where you might think I've committed the unforgivable sin, and you're tempted to reassure yourself that you haven't, but ENRP will say, yes, I'm sure I have, and I'm sure I'm going to hell, but let's crack on and make a cup of tea and see
Yeah.
if we can make a good way, through our day. So it's a willingness to welcome in your worst assumptions, but almost you're knowing that God is above all that.
Mm.
So it's not like you who are making it happen. You're like, yeah, I can be playful with this stuff and irreverent with it, because ultimately God has called me by name and God knows me and God has saved me. So you can not wrestle, if you like, with the thorns. You can kind of come up and see over the top.
And
Uh,
it sounds to me like someone who doesn't have OCD, that some of the things that you're advocating for are actually just really good principles in general. Is that fair, or are there some things that actually are very specific to how you support someone with OCD?
I mean, I think the two treatment outcomes, particularly ACT therapy, I really like. Um, as a sort of general tool, ENRP can be quite intense and quite painful,
Yeah.
um, and it's really built on the premise that you have OCD.
Yeah.
It's not; these aren't thoughts that you enjoy. They're what's called ego dystonic thoughts. They kind of go against your core values.
Mm.
So they have to go against your core values for you to embrace them. If
That
that
makes
makes
sense.
sense,
Yeah.
you're befriending thoughts that you don't want to have.
Yeah.
What you're not doing is you're not embracing thoughts that you secretly do want to
Yeah,
have.
yeah, yeah.
so,
Yeah, that's a
so
really
there's
good distinction.
there's
Yeah.
there's a specific need that's a specific OCD based tool. But ACT therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, is like a gratitude sort of tool. It's like I'm accepting my, for example, with OCD, I'm accepting my discomfort and I'm committing to live today wholeheartedly, whatever my body or my mind feels. So I'm like, I'm welcoming the moment and I'm accepting this without resistance.
Mhm.
And that is really helpful
Yeah.
because most of us are bent out of shape by resistance to what we don't want to feel.
Mm.
Um, it's not that we're um, sort of toughing it out. And it's not that we're sort of not acknowledging the pain that we're feeling. It's just that what we're saying is I'm accepting it wholeheartedly and I'm committing to live my life with my values. And I think, particularly in the West, Christianity has a relatively soft ride compared to the persecuted church globally. And sometimes we can be quite precious about how we feel and about what our faith does for us. And actually, there's something beautiful about, you know, just accepting the struggle and the suffering and committing to live wholeheartedly for the Lord, whatever happens. And that's much more aligned to people in nations where Christianity is under a lot more pressure. They're saying, I'm accepting, my distinctiveness for Jesus and I'm committing to suffer
Mm.
as a consequence. Whatever happens, I'm going to live wholeheartedly for the Lord. So it does feel like a very powerful discipleship tool to me.
Yeah, really powerful because I know that one of the core issues that we face around the mental health issue in general is the minute we start struggling, we assume that there's something wrong and we're getting something wrong, as opposed to the idea of just embracing the fact that struggle will be part of our existence. It's kind of what we do with that. That's great. I'm aware we don't have a huge amount of time left, but I would love to ask you a specific question around how we think about healing or praying for the issue of OCD. And at one of our previous conversations we had, Will, you said something really interesting. You said that you've done a lot of work over the years around stigma when it comes to mental health. And you said that the stigma has shifted. It's not so much about mental health as a general topic. Actually, in the church, the stigma has shifted to the idea and the concept of healing and what we mean by healing. And so I know we don't necessarily put OCD under the neurodivergent bracket, but I know when it comes to neurodivergence, that is one of the things people are thinking through and processing. It's like if you're sat down pastoring somebody and you can recognize that actually the things they're struggling with, that's actually part of a neurodivergence issue, or it's part of OCD. It kind of makes us want to rethink about how we approach the idea of healing. Do we expect healing from our OCD tendencies? Is that something we should be praying for? Is it something we shouldn't be praying for? Is it actually part of our identity? I would love to know, as someone that's a chaplain themselves, how you've navigated that and what you would do if someone walked in and said, well, I'm really struggling. I need prayer. I need healing. And actually, as you unpacked it, you realized that underneath all this was OCD. Like, how do you navigate that?
Yes, great question, Bryn. And interestingly, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the kind of diagnostic Bible, if you like, of mental health disorders, has up to now always categorized OCD under the anxiety category. So it's been known as an anxiety disorder. This year, I think for the first time, the DSM has separated out obsessive compulsive disorder and under the title obsessive disorders.
Mm,
So he's actually saying, hold on a minute, is this really all about anxiety? It certainly creates anxiety, but is it really an anxiety disorder? Because if it was an anxiety disorder, it would tend to go away if the anxiety itself went away.
yeah.
And so by creating a new category, by creating this what's called obsessive disorders category, it, they're not saying it's neurodivergence, but they're certainly saying the brain is working here in a unique way.
Yeah.
And there is increasingly interesting studies around PET scans and the shape of the brain that suggest that there is a thin film which is being breached, if you like, between two parts
Yeah.
of the brain. So the imaginative part, the hypothalamus, is breaching, thoughts are
Yeah.
breaching into part of our brain that's responsible for more rational thoughts.
Mm,
And so our imagination and our rational mind are kind of colliding. Now, this is quite early in terms of their research, but it's an interesting idea that would lean more towards the idea that people with OCD have a unique way of thinking. And the fact that it is a lifelong and chronic disorder would suggest that this is an operating system issue
yeah.
rather than an illness per se. So it's, so for me, I certainly recognize it from the age of 7 and I'm 50 now. And I've worked with hundreds of people with OCD. They would all describe OCD as appearing pretty much uniformly in childhood, apart from an appearance of OCD in postpartum mums. So
Mm.
it can appear after the birth of a child, and often that sort of OCD will often dissipate as well after that period of time. So there is a unique category there. But for most people, it feels like a lifelong journey in the same way that neurodivergence would be. For me, healing is recognizing that we live in a broken and fallen world, and that brokenness, that fallenness is manifest in all of my body.
Yeah.
Sadly, there's no part of my body which isn't suffering from death and decay. And my brain is working exactly the same way. And so when I think about healing, I think about intrusive disease that I can get free from, uh, which makes sense because it's come for a period of time and it's transient, or it's not part of me.
Mm.
Or I think about living with this broken body, which is not entirely redeemed, or it's not yet a kingdom body, and that feels much more like OCD as a narrative.
Mm.
What we know about OCD clinically is that trying to escape OCD only propagates OCD. So the more resistant you are to having OCD, the more denial you express, the much more lively and likely there are to be inhibiting patterns of obsession and compulsion. Because ultimately, that desire to get away from your thoughts is what drives all of these behaviors. So the more externalized the behavior, the more sort of hand washing we do or avoidance we might do, the more we believe that escape is possible. Whereas actually healing comes from embrace,
Mm.
and you have to disposition yourself towards like, yeah, this is a great OCD moment for me to grow. I'm going to embrace this porcupine. It's spiky, it's painful, but I know hugging it
Mm.
is better than letting it escape or trying to shoo it away.
Mm.
So there's a sort of journey for that. You know, prayer really changes things. But my prayers now are very much about the presence of the Lord
Mm.
being with me in my struggle, not taking away my struggle. And I think about Paul, and him crying out to the Lord 3 times for the thorn to be removed, which, I love Pablo Martinez's book about that, the thorn in the flesh, this idea he probably had some sort of glaucoma, some eyesight disorder, which is why he ended up being led where he didn't want to go, the sort of prophecy. Um, but the loss of his eyesight was something that he couldn't change. Despite crying out for help,
Mm.
he accepted his blindness, and then he accepted the help of someone leading him. With OCD, I have to sort of accept my mental blindness there, and I have to lean on the Lord,
Mm.
and that comes through prayer. So the Lord helps me to accept those things that I cannot change, and that's a really powerful part of the serenity prayer,
Mm.
which again lets me live more free.
Mm.
Um, and celebrating the freedom we have despite our struggle
Mm.
is a really powerful part of Christian discipleship. I think that as I've got older as well, OCD changes with our own fatalism.
Mm.
So when we're young, we're trying to save our life. I love the passage that says, if those who try and save their life will lose it, but those who try and lose their life for my sake will save it. Unless a seed fall to the ground and die, it bear not fruit. There's something about surrender which is actually liberation. And the weird thing about OCD is the more control we try and issue, the more likely we are to be bound by OCD. So as I'm getting older, I'm becoming more grateful of the life that I have ahead of me, if
Mm.
for whatever day, week, or month. Um, and that embracing of my mortality, my recognition of my invulnerability, my acknowledgement that actually my time is precious. It's the only commodity I have that I really value. How I'm going to live, that informs my therapy, that informs my commitment, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is core part of my prayer. So I pray the rosary every day. Not that I'm Catholic in spirituality, but I pray the 5 beads of the Lord's Prayer, and then I try to pray for 60 people around the big circle every morning.
Amazing.
And I find that like every day
Mm.
I'm I'm like, Lord, for myself and for these people to live a full life,
Mm.
vital life, despite whatever it might be that is a burden to us.
Mhm.
That feels great.
Mhm.
That feels like that's my commitment, and in a way, my OCD diminishes the more I embrace the pain
Mm.
and determine to live my life in line with the values that the Lord has given me.
Well, that is so, so powerful, and you've done such a good job of unpacking it. So When Thoughts Get Stuck is out now. I would really encourage anyone that is struggling with it or supporting people, so pastors, anyone in a position where you might be coming up against people that are navigating this journey. Yeah,
Yeah,
short.
we've got a copy there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, please do grab a copy. Before we sign off, Will, is there any sort of parting encouragement you want to give? If there's someone listening to this that is either realizing they do have OCD or they've known it for a while. How would you just give them a final thought of encouragement?
Yeah, I would just really encourage you to break the shame and silence around OCD. I know that there's actually a really interesting and lovely little forward in this, well, one of my commendations. So let me just tell you about it briefly, because this is very special to me, because one of the guys I've been supporting as a kind of friend and a peer leader over 20 years is a guy called Paul. And let me just read you what he says. He says, "I've never read an entire book as fast as this one. It's skillfully and responsibly written, giving great insight and understanding to the condition of OCD. Those reading from a Christian background will find the biblical perspectives helpful and comforting. And I congratulate Will and Thea's raw honesty in sharing their own struggles. It's given me the courage as a fellow struggler to push through the shame and put my own name to this. I want to commend this book to others living with this condition and their loved ones to help them understand and provide the right kind of support." Now, this guy is called Paul Daniels. He's lead pastor of a large church in Northern Ireland. And he wrote an article for us at Mind and Soul Foundation called The Beast of OCD 10 years ago,
Mm.
anonymously. His kids didn't even know that he had OCD. They're grown-up children. They didn't know that this was his struggle. And I sent him this book. He read the book and he said, and I said, "Look, Paul, you can write anonymously." And he said, "You know what? This book has given me the courage to own my own story."
Oh,
And he
that's amazing.
told his children this is his struggle. And as I say, in print now, in the inside copy, it's his name. And,
Oh,
he's
that in
owned his
itself
story the
is
first time.
method, doesn't it? That is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that was like a fantastic moment of someone who literally, I've known Paul for 20 years and he's really struggled with OCD, but he struggled alone.
Mm.
And I was one of the few people who knew what he was going through. And so just to have him actually respond to the book by putting his name to that commendation was really powerful for me personally, and I hope for him.
Mm.
And it was a great first step to freedom, is owning what our struggles really are. So
Mm.
if you're alone, I really want to encourage you, find out more about OCD. OCD is not one thing; it's a complicated disorder, and whatever you've seen in the media, it doesn't all look like that. You're looking out for those two things: intrusive obsessive thoughts and hidden compulsions that often can't be seen by anyone else. They're often just in your head. Find out as much as you can and then reach out, get some help. Doctors today do know about OCD, and there's lots of great material online as well. OCD Action is probably the best UK charity to start with if you want to find out a bit more.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And what a blessing you are to
Thanks,
people
Bryn.
navigating this.
I appreciate all you're doing with Mercy, and all the great work you're doing as well with Keys to Freedom.
Amazing. Thank you.
Take care. See you soon. Thanks, Sonny. Cheers.